Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The scar on my left shoulder throbs every morning when I wake up. 3 months ago, it was a bullet wound from a firefight in an underground facility that shouldn't exist. Now it's something else entirely. The tissue has changed, hardened into something that feels more like ceramic than flesh. It's a reminder of what happened beneath the Antarctic ice, and what's still happening right now while the world sleeps peacefully above. My name is Nathan Harker, and what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but the physical evidence is carved into my body, and the psychological evidence haunts every quiet moment I've had since returning from the bottom of the world. This isn't just a story about what we found under the ice. It's a warning about what found us, and what it's been planning for the 30 years since we first disturbed its slumber. I need you to understand my background before I begin, because credibility matters when you're describing events that redefine human existence. I spent 12 years in the United States Navy, specializing in underwater demolitions and hostile environment operations. After my discharge with full honours, I transitioned to private military contracting, the kind of work that takes you to places that don't appear on maps, dealing with situations that governments prefer to handle through deniable assets. My resume included operations that would make most people question their sanity. I've pulled classified materials from sunken Soviet submarines in Arctic waters, where the ocean itself seemed hostile to human presence. I've cleared abandoned research facilities in the Sahara, where entire scientific teams vanished, leaving behind only radiation signatures and bloodstains that told stories no one wanted to hear. I've extracted personnel from underground installations, where the architecture suggested construction techniques that predated known civilization. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for Antarctica. Nothing could have. It started with a phone call at exactly 7:15 on a Wednesday morning in February. The secure line that only rang for emergency contracts cut through the silence of my Seattle apartment like a scream. The voice belonged to Director Harrison from the International Antarctic Research Consortium, and I could hear something in his tone that made my blood cold. The carefully controlled panic of a man who'd seen something that challenged his understanding of reality. "We have a situation at Station Volkov 7, he said without preamble, his words clipped and precise. Russian ice research facility, 30 miles northeast of the main Vostok installation. They went silent 48 hours ago after transmitting something that our analysts are calling unprecedented. The word unprecedented in government speak usually means impossible, which in my experience translates to extremely dangerous and probably lethal. I was on a plane to the consortium's Seattle headquarters within 2 hours. The briefing room was filled with people whose job titles didn't match their obvious military bearing. Intelligence analysts who moved like special forces operators, scientists who carried themselves like combat veterans, and at the centre of it all, Director Harrison, a man whose public persona suggested academic administration, but whose eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much classified horror. "Before I play you the recording," Harrison said, his hands visibly shaking as he reached for the audio controls, "I need you to understand that this transmission was intercepted by monitoring stations in 3 different countries. It's been analysed by our best people, and every technical assessment confirms its authenticity." What I heard in that recording still wakes me up at night, drenched in sweat and reaching for weapons that can't protect against memories. the transmission from station Vulov 7 came through layers of static and electromagnetic interference that seemed almost alive, but the content was crystal clear and absolutely impossible according to everything we thought we knew about Antarctic operations. Russian voices distorted by fear and distance, screaming about machinery, awakening deep under the ice. Descriptions of research personnel transforming into something that retained human intelligence but had abandoned human limitations. And underneath it all, a sound like massive industrial equipment grinding to life after centuries of dormancy, but organic, breathing, alive in ways that machinery shouldn't be. The clearest transmission came near the end, and Harrison's translator had gone pale while providing the English version. Oni vychodiat izleda, oni pomniat vise, oni используют naše оружие против нас. Pustite nas uiti. The translation chilled my blood. They're emerging from the ice. They remember everything. They're using our own weapons against us. Let us leave. Then came the sounds that redefined my understanding of human terror. Automatic weapons fire echoing through what sounded like a vast underground industrial space, but the acoustics were wrong. Too organic. Too alive. The gunfire was answered by sounds that might have been return fire, but using projectiles that moved through air with velocities that conventional weapons couldn't achieve. Russian voices coordinating tactical responses in clipped military terminology, followed by the same voices seconds later producing sounds that human vocal cords weren't designed to make. Communications in languages that had never been spoken by terrestrial life, but with syntax and tactical content that suggested advanced military coordination. The final seconds of the recording contained automatic weapons fire that cut off mid-burst, replaced by a low humming that seemed to pulse with organic rhythm. Then, silence. Not the empty quiet of equipment failure, but the pregnant stillness of something waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to act. Every technical analysis confirms that those voices belong to the same personnel throughout the recording. Harrison continued, his hands now clasped tightly to prevent their trembling. But the vocal pattern analysis shows physiological changes that should be impossible without surgical intervention, and the final communications. Our linguists can't identify the language, but the mathematical structure suggests tactical coordination at a level that exceeds any known military doctrine. Satellite imagery showed Station Vulov 7's buildings intact but exhibiting thermal signatures that suggested internal temperatures far above normal human habitation ranges. No electromagnetic emissions typical of human technology, but energy readings that indicated massive power consumption from sources that didn't appear in any engineering database. More disturbing were the geometric formations visible in the ice surrounding the station, perfectly symmetrical patterns extending for miles in every direction, suggesting underground construction on a scale that would dwarf any known installation. Thermal imaging revealed these formations were generating their own heat, maintaining temperatures that should have been impossible in Antarctic conditions. The situation presents obvious diplomatic complications, Harrison explained, as classified satellite images filled the briefing room screens. No government wants to commit military resources to what could become an international incident, but the energy signatures we're detecting suggest technologies that could revolutionize global power production or weaponization. We need people who can assess the situation and extract any recoverable intelligence without official government involvement. Translation: they needed expendable assets who could provide plausible deniability if the operation went wrong. People like me, who specialized in walking into impossible situations and either solving them or dying quietly enough to avoid diplomatic consequences. My team was assembled within 6 hours of my acceptance. 5 specialists, each chosen not just for technical expertise, but for psychological resilience and the ability to function under stress that would break most people. We'd worked together on previous contracts, which meant we understood each other's capabilities and limitations, crucial advantages when operating in environments where standard protocols might not apply. Captain Ezra Kincaid was our mission commander, a 28-year veteran whose service record was mostly classified, but included conflicts in places that officially didn't exist. Kincaid had the kind of experience that came from leading operations where the enemy wasn't always entirely human, and he understood that some situations required solutions that couldn't be found in any tactical manual. His calm demeanour and analytical approach to impossible problems made him exactly the kind of leader needed for operations beyond normal military parameters. Marek Volkov claimed to be a Russian geological engineer specializing in Soviet-era research protocols, but everything about him suggested intelligence operative with deep knowledge of classified programs. His familiarity with Soviet documentation systems was too detailed and too personal for someone with his supposed academic background. When he thought no one was watching, I caught him studying classified materials, with the expression of a man confronting his worst memories rather than learning new information. Jonas Keating handled our demolitions and heavy weapon systems. Former Marine Force recon with multiple combat deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, Jonas masked his obvious anxiety behind constant dark humour and an encyclopedic knowledge of explosive ordnance. His equipment loadout for the Antarctic mission included enough high-yield charges to level a city block, which should have been our first warning about what we were expected to encounter in the ice. Dr. Ilara Wynne served as our biologist and medical officer, with 5 years of field experience in environments where standard protocols didn't apply. Her background included research in extremophile organisms, genetic adaptation studies, and biological responses to hostile environments. Her excitement about the mission was infectious and deeply unsettling. She talked about unprecedented discovery opportunities with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never encountered a discovery that actively wanted to kill her. The final team member was Maria Santos, our communications and electronic warfare specialist. Former Air Force with advanced training in signal intelligence and electronic countermeasures, Maria had experience with equipment that operated beyond conventional electromagnetic spectra. Her gear included monitoring devices that could detect and analyze energy signatures from sources that didn't appear in any technical manual. Our flight to Antarctica took 18 hours through increasingly hostile weather conditions that seemed to worsen as we approached our destination. Thompson, our pilot, was a 20-year veteran of polar operations who'd transported research teams to some of the most remote and dangerous locations on Earth. His experience included classified flights to installations that officially didn't exist, which made his growing nervousness during our approach particularly concerning. "Instruments are going haywire," Thompson reported over the intercom as we flew through turbulence that felt almost purposeful in its intensity. "Magnetic compass is spinning like a roulette wheel. GPS is showing coordinates that place us in 3 different locations simultaneously, and I'm picking up radio signals that can't be coming from any human source." Maria confirmed his readings from her position at the communications station. "I'm detecting electromagnetic emissions across spectra that require power sources in the gigawatt range," she reported, her voice tight with scientific fascination and growing concern. "The signal pattern suggests coordinate transmission from multiple sources, but the mathematical structure doesn't match any known communication protocol. The coordinates led us to a site that violated everything I thought I knew about Antarctic geography and geology. Instead of the research station we'd expected to find, there was a crater in the ice that looked like a precisely engineered wound in the landscape itself. The opening was perfectly circular, nearly a quarter-mile across, with edges that showed signs of controlled melting rather than explosive or seismic damage. At the bottom of this crater, partially visible through swirling steam that rose from depths that should have been frozen solid, were the exposed remains of an industrial complex that had no business existing under Antarctic ice. The architecture was wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. Structures that seemed to extend in directions that shouldn't be possible according to three-dimensional geometry, connected by walkways that appeared to twist through space in configurations that human engineering had never developed. The visible portions were constructed from materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating surfaces that seemed to drink in our aircraft's spotlights and convert the illumination into something else entirely. The metal, if it was metal, had a quality that made your eyes want to slide away from it, as if your brain was actively refusing to process the visual information. But what made my blood freeze were the massive organic-looking protrusions jutting from the ice around the crater's perimeter. These formations pulsed with their own internal rhythm, like enormous arteries feeding something buried deep beneath the Antarctic surface. Thermal imaging revealed they extended for miles underground, connecting the visible facility to a network of installations that spanned hundreds of square miles. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines. 20 years flying over this continent, and I've never seen anything like this. The whole area is generating its own weather patterns. Look at the cloud formations. They're moving in geometric patterns that don't match any meteorological model." He was right. The clouds above the crater moved in perfectly symmetrical spirals, as if they were being controlled by forces that understood atmospheric dynamics better than terrestrial weather systems. Lightning flickered between the cloud layers, but the electrical discharges followed straight lines and right angles, rather than the chaotic patterns typical of natural phenomena. Thompson set us down 2 miles from the crater's edge and made his position absolutely clear. 72 hours, he said, his hands shaking as he shut down the helicopter's engines. Radio contact's been cutting in and out since we got within 50 miles of this place. My instruments are reading energy signatures that violate half the laws of physics, and the electromagnetic interference is affecting systems that should be hardened against anything short of nuclear EMP. As his helicopter disappeared into the white sky, the crushing weight of Antarctic isolation settled over us like a physical presence. But it wasn't just the empty landscape and hostile environment. There was something else in the air, a sense of vast intelligence observing our every movement from beneath tons of ice and alien architecture. Our approach to the crater revealed details that became more disturbing with each step forward. The ice beneath our feet felt wrong, too warm in some places, too cold in others, with a texture that seemed more organic than crystalline. Strange formations jutted from the ground at irregular intervals, and when Maria's equipment detected electromagnetic signatures emanating from these protrusions, Dr. Wynn's excitement became almost manic. "The readings are incredible," she reported, her voice tight with scientific anticipation that bordered on obsession. "These formations are generating their own energy fields, using principles that don't appear in any physics textbook. The molecular analysis suggests biological processes that shouldn't be possible at these temperatures." The electromagnetic emissions were affecting our equipment in ways that suggested purposeful interference, rather than random environmental factors. Radio communications produced sounds like whale songs mixed with digital static. GPS readings placed us in locations that shifted minute by minute, and our weapons' electronic systems displayed targeting information that showed movement signatures underground, lots of them, all coordinated, all apparently aware of our presence above. The smell reached us when we were still 100 yards from the crater's edge. Ozone mixed with something sweet and organic, like flowers that had been left to rot in an electrical storm. But underneath those scents was something else, something that made my hindbrain scream warnings about predators and territorial markers. It was the smell of intelligence that had evolved along completely different evolutionary paths, but had learned to recognize human scent as something significant. Dr. Wynn's atmospheric analysis detected elevated levels of organic compounds that didn't appear in any terrestrial database, mixed with metallic particulates that seemed to be artificially manufactured rather than naturally occurring. The air composition suggests ongoing industrial processes, she reported, but using biological methods that combine organic chemistry with metallurgy in ways that human technology hasn't developed. We rappelled into the crater using climbing equipment that seemed pathetically inadequate for the scale of what we were facing. The walls were lined with that same light-absorbing material, and our headlamps created weak pools of illumination that were actively consumed by the darkness around them. The ropes themselves began exhibiting unusual properties during our descent, becoming more flexible in some sections, more rigid in others, as if the materials were being analysed and modified by contact with the crater walls. As we descended, the temperature rose steadily despite our increasing depth beneath the ice. By the time we reached the bottom, the air was warm enough that steam rose from our breathing apparatus, and our protective gear's cooling systems were working at maximum capacity. The facility below stretched beyond our lights in every direction, with structures that seemed to pulse and shift when viewed peripherally. The architecture followed engineering principles that human civilization had never developed. Corridors branched and merged in patterns that created spatial paradoxes, making distances impossible to judge accurately. Some passages appeared to extend infinitely into the darkness, while others seemed to fold back on themselves in ways that made my inner ear malfunction just from visual input. Walking through these spaces required constant reference to compass bearings, because the geometry itself seemed designed to disorient human navigation instincts. Power was flowing through the complex, but not through any conventional electrical distribution system. Organic conduits snaked along the walls and ceilings, pulsing with bioluminescent energy that shifted through colours I didn't have names for. The illumination these conduits provided was somehow more effective than our artificial lighting, revealing details in the architecture that remained hidden when viewed with standard equipment. The air hummed with energy that made our teeth ache, and our radio equipment produce sounds like technological whale songs. Maria's instruments detected power flows in the terawatt range, but couldn't identify the generation source or storage mechanisms that would be required for such massive energy production. "This isn't a research station," Kincaid said, his voice carefully controlled as he surveyed the alien architecture surrounding us. "This is something else entirely, something that was never meant to be discovered by surface dwellers." His tactical assessment was correct. The facility's layout followed defensive principles that assumed three-dimensional combat in environments where conventional physics didn't necessarily apply. Corridors provided overlapping fields of fire for weapons that didn't require line-of-sight targeting. Structural supports were positioned to create kill zones that could be activated by intelligence that understood human movement patterns intimately. Volkov had gone completely silent during our descent, moving through the facility with a familiarity that confirmed every suspicion I'd had about his true identity and background. When Kincaid confronted him directly, demanding explanations for his obviously prior knowledge of the installation, Volkov's response sent chills through the entire team. 30 years ago, Soviet science thought it could control what we found in the ice, he said, staring into the pulsing darkness ahead of us, with eyes that held decades of suppressed guilt. We believed we could harness biological processes that had been dormant since before human civilization began. We were catastrophically wrong. The knowledge came with a price that we're still paying, and that price is about to come due for the entire human species. The first bodies we discovered were in what appeared to be a control center filled with equipment that existed at the intersection of technology and biology. The monitoring stations breathed with organic rhythm, their surfaces warm and yielding to the touch. 3 Russian researchers still in their winter gear were positioned around these biotechnological interfaces as if they'd been operating the systems when death claimed them. They'd been dead for decades, perfectly preserved by environmental conditions that somehow maintained optimal temperature and humidity despite the Antarctic location. But their final moments had been anything but peaceful, and their bodies told a story that challenged basic assumptions about human physiology and the boundaries between life and death. Their faces were frozen in expressions of transcendent terror, not the simple fear of dying, but the horror of understanding something that human consciousness wasn't equipped to process without fundamental alteration. Their hands were pressed against their temples, fingers having dug so deeply into their skulls that bone was visible beneath flesh that had been torn away by their own desperate clawing. Dr. Wynn's examination revealed details that made our situation infinitely worse than we'd anticipated. The cranial structure shows signs of rapid expansion, she reported, her voice unsteady for the first time since I'd known her. Their brains were growing at the time of death, developing new neural structures that don't appear in normal human anatomy. And there are foreign materials integrated with their nervous tissue, something that was rewriting their brain architecture at the molecular level. She also found traces of an unknown substance in their bloodstream, something that had been systematically altering their genetic code in real time. The modifications weren't random, they followed specific patterns that suggested purposeful enhancement of human cognitive and physical capabilities according to a template that predated terrestrial evolution. "Look at this," Dr. Wynn continued, her scientific fascination overriding her obvious revulsion. "The bone density has increased by approximately 300%, but the skeletal structure has been lightened through internal modifications that shouldn't be possible without surgical intervention. Their muscle tissue shows fiber arrangements that would provide strength levels far beyond normal human capacity." But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the transformations had been interactive rather than simply imposed. The researchers had been operating the facility's systems during their change, learning to interface with technology that responded to mental commands rather than physical manipulation. They had become part of the installation's operating procedures, their enhanced consciousness integrated with technological systems that spanned the entire underground complex. As we ventured deeper into the facility, we encountered laboratories that belonged in nightmares rather than any scientific institution. Room after room filled with equipment that existed at the intersection of technology and biology. Machines that breathed with organic rhythm. Computers with surfaces that felt warm and yielding to the touch. Monitoring systems that tracked biological processes I didn't want to understand. The specimens preserved in the laboratory chambers represented horrors beyond anything I'd encountered in 12 years of military service in hostile environments. These weren't just human subjects that had been modified through conventional genetic engineering. They were examples of controlled evolution according to principles that had never developed on Earth during natural evolutionary processes. Extended limbs ending in appendages designed for purposes I couldn't identify, with joint structures that allowed movement in directions that human anatomy couldn't accommodate. Nervous systems that had been rewired to process sensory input from organs that shouldn't exist, creating beings capable of perceiving electromagnetic spectra that human consciousness couldn't access. Skeletal structures that had been rebuilt to support body configurations that violated every principle of terrestrial anatomy while maintaining obvious intelligence and purposeful design. But the most disturbing specimens were the ones that were still alive after decades of preservation. Eyes that tracked our movements through the containment fluid with obvious intelligence and what appeared to be recognition. Mouths that opened and closed in patterns that might have been attempts at communication using vocal techniques that human physiology couldn't produce. hands that pressed against the glass containment with desperate urgency that suggested retained awareness of their condition and desire for release. This represents controlled evolution according to a predetermined template, Dr. Wynne whispered, her scientific fascination warring with obvious horror at the implications. They weren't just modifying existing human traits through conventional genetic manipulation. They were introducing entirely new biological systems based on genetic templates that predate terrestrial life by millions of years. The documentation we found throughout the complex painted a picture of a research project that had evolved far beyond its original parameters and discovered something that challenged every assumption about life on Earth. The facility was designated Complex Zero, the primary installation for something called Project Chimera. But this wasn't the crude genetic experimentation typical of Cold War-era scientific programs. According to the research logs, which Vulov translated with obvious reluctance and growing psychological distress, Soviet scientists had discovered something in Antarctic ice cores that revolutionized understanding of biological development on a planetary scale. Preserved organic material that was millions of years old, but showed clear signs of deliberate engineering rather than natural evolutionary processes. The genetic sequences they'd recovered included structures that had never appeared in any known terrestrial organism, but demonstrated obvious artificial design and purposeful integration with existing biological systems. More disturbing, the material seemed to function as a comprehensive biological template, a complete set of instructions for transforming existing life forms according to a design that predated human civilization by geological ages. The early experiments focused on military enhancement, Vulov finally admitted, his voice hollow with decades of suppressed guilt and growing understanding of the magnitude of what had been unleashed. We thought we could create enhanced soldiers with improved physical capabilities, environmental resistance, and tactical intelligence. The initial results exceeded every expectation and suggested applications that could revolutionize human potential. But as the project progressed, it became clear that the research team wasn't simply modifying human test subjects through conventional genetic engineering. They were awakening something that had been dormant in terrestrial DNA since the dawn of life on Earth, something that remembered its original purpose and intended development. The transformation process wasn't random mutation or enhancement of existing human traits. It was the activation of genetic potential that had been locked away in all terrestrial life forms for millions of years, waiting for the right conditions and catalysts to express itself according to the original biological design template. We realized too late that we weren't creating enhanced humans, Vulov continued, his hands shaking as he translated documents that obviously held personal significance. We were awakening Earth's original children, beings that possessed the planet long before natural evolution took the wrong path and created the limited life forms we see today. And they remembered everything, not just their individual existence, but the entire history of what this planet was supposed to become. The most terrifying revelation came in the final research entries, which described events that had led to the facility's hasty abandonment and burial under tons of ice and concrete. The transformed subjects hadn't simply broken containment through violence or accident. They had evolved beyond the need for containment entirely, developing capabilities that made human security measures irrelevant. They possessed intelligence that far exceeded their human origins, but more significantly, they had retained and enhanced their human memories while gaining access to genetic knowledge that spanned millions of years of planetary development. They understood human psychology, technology, and tactical capabilities better than the researchers who had created them, because they had become something that combined human knowledge with alien intelligence. The final log entries described subjects who had simply walked out of the facility when they were ready to begin the next phase of their existence. They hadn't escaped, they had graduated, leaving behind an installation that would serve as a staging area for the eventual transformation of all terrestrial life according to the original template. But they had left something behind in the facility's systems, a biological network that continued their work in their absence, growing and learning and preparing for their eventual return to complete what had been started 3 decades ago. The first attack on our team came without warning, but with obvious intelligence and tactical sophistication behind every move. Jonas was examining what appeared to be a biological interface station when something erupted from the organic conduits that lined the walls. Not a mindless creature, but a transformed human that moved with predatory grace and demonstrated obvious tactical awareness of our capabilities and limitations. The thing that emerged had once been human. I could see traces of that original form in its basic skeletal structure and overall configuration. But it had been rebuilt according to evolutionary principles that belonged to a completely different biological paradigm, one that prioritized combat effectiveness and tactical superiority over the limitations that constrained normal human physiology. Its skin had become something that shifted between organic tissue and what appeared to be mechanical components, creating a surface that could harden for protection or become flexible for enhanced mobility based on immediate tactical requirements. The skeletal structure had been redesigned to accommodate both quadrupedal and bipedal movement, with limbs that could reconfigure themselves for different combat situations with disturbing fluidity. Most terrifying were the sensory organs that had been developed beyond anything in human anatomy. Multiple eyes positioned to provide complete spherical vision, each capable of perceiving electromagnetic spectra that human vision couldn't access. Auditory systems that seemed to process not just sound waves but vibrations through solid matter and electromagnetic emissions from our equipment, and appendages that appeared designed for direct neural interface with the facility's biological systems, allowing real-time coordination with the installation's defensive capabilities. But it was the intelligence behind those alien eyes that made my blood freeze and my tactical training seem inadequate. This wasn't a mindless monster driven by instinct or hunger. It was a predator that understood human psychology, tactics, and equipment limitations better than most military personnel. It had retained its human knowledge while gaining capabilities that made our advantages irrelevant. Jonas opened fire with his assault rifle, the muzzle flashes lighting up the corridor like a strobe light and revealing more movement in the shadows around us. I could see his rounds hitting the creature's center mass, but instead of falling or showing signs of injury, it seemed to analyze our weapon's capabilities while dark fluid sprayed from the impact points. Its movements became more fluid and evasive with each shot, as if it was learning optimal evasion patterns in real time. "Contact!" Kincaid shouted into his radio, bringing his rifle to bear as more shapes emerged from passages we hadn't noticed in the organic architecture. Multiple hostiles engaging now, they're using tactical movement patterns. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything in my military experience or training. These creatures moved with coordination that suggested shared intelligence and real-time tactical communication, but they fought with individual creativity and adaptation that made them completely unpredictable in combat situations. They used the facility's alien architecture to their advantage, appearing from unexpected angles and disappearing into passages that seemed to close behind them like living tissue. But more than that, they demonstrated understanding of human tactical doctrines and began implementing countermeasures that neutralized our training advantages. When we took cover behind what appeared to be structural supports, they attacked from directions that bypassed our defensive positions entirely. When we attempted to establish overlapping fields of fire, they coordinated their movements to exploit the gaps in our coverage. When we tried to use suppressing fire to control their movement, they responded with projectiles launched from specialized organs that outranged our weapons and moved with velocities that conventional firearms couldn't achieve. Our weapons were effective. We could wound them, slow them down, even kill them with concentrated fire. But they adapted to our tactics with terrifying speed, learning to avoid our sightlines and exploit the fraction of a second delays in human reaction time that no amount of training could eliminate. The transformed subjects grabbed Jonas during a tactical reload, moving faster than human reflexes could track and dragging him into the facility's depths before any of us could provide covering fire. His screams echoed through the complex, but they weren't sounds of pain or terror. They were vocalizations that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce, as if he was already beginning to change and learning to communicate with his captors. Dr. Wynn's readings detected massive spore concentrations throughout the facility's atmosphere, released during the combat engagement. Whatever had caused the original transformations 30 years ago was now actively dispersing through the air, waiting for breaches in our protective equipment to begin its work on new subjects. The organisms are incredibly sophisticated, she reported while reloading her sidearm with hands that shook from adrenaline and growing scientific fascination. They're designed to integrate with human nervous systems during periods of elevated stress and adrenaline production. Combat conditions create optimal environments for accelerated transformation processes. Maria's communication equipment was picking up transmissions throughout the facility that sounded like tactical coordination in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. "They're using our own communication protocols," she reported, her voice tight with disbelief. "But the information density is far beyond anything human technology could process. They're sharing tactical intelligence in real time across the entire complex." We could hear Jonas somewhere in the facility's depths, but the sounds weren't screams of torment or calls for help. They were tactical communications coordinating with other transformed subjects, describing our equipment, capabilities and movement patterns in languages that combined human tactical terminology with concepts that human minds couldn't grasp. What followed was 8 hours of running firefights through corridors that seemed to reconfigure themselves to favor our enemies. The creatures had turned the facility into a three-dimensional battlefield where they controlled every advantage, and they were using our own tactical knowledge against us in ways that made our training a liability rather than an asset. They struck from floor grates that opened at precisely calculated moments to catch us during weapon reloads. They attacked from ceiling vents, positioned to exploit the blind spots created by our helmet-mounted equipment. They emerged from wall panels that had been invisible seconds before, as if the facility itself was actively participating in the combat engagement. During one engagement, Kincaid emptied 2 full magazines into a creature that seemed to study his weapon's rate of fire, reload procedures and malfunction tendencies before responding with coordinated attacks from multiple angles. The thing demonstrated tactical intelligence that matched or exceeded military training, using suppressing fire principles with organic projectiles that it launched from specialized organs developed specifically for combat applications. The creature's projectiles moved with velocities that suggested propulsion systems based on principles the human ballistics hadn't developed. They could change direction in flight, actively seeking targets, using guidance systems that tracked electromagnetic signatures from our equipment, and they delivered payloads that seemed designed specifically to counter human protective gear, dissolving through materials that should have been resistant to chemical attack. Another encounter saw Dr. Wynn engaged in a running gun battle with something that had once been a Russian researcher but now moved like liquid mercury through spaces too small for human passage. She put 6 rounds center mass before the creature adapted its approach, using the facility's organic systems to attack through the walls themselves rather than relying on conventional movement through open spaces. The transformed subjects demonstrated tactical intelligence that exceeded human military doctrine by incorporating capabilities that no human training could prepare for. They could phase through solid matter when necessary, appear simultaneously in multiple locations through methods that violated basic physics, and coordinate their attacks using communication systems that operated faster than electronic data transmission. They were learning from every engagement, sharing tactical intelligence through methods that bypassed conventional communication entirely. Each firefight made them more dangerous, more coordinated, more capable of predicting our responses and implementing countermeasures that turned our own training against us. But the most terrifying aspect of these encounters was the growing realization that they weren't trying to kill us outright. They were studying our capabilities, learning our limitations, and testing our equipment's effectiveness against their enhanced abilities. We were being evaluated as potential candidates for transformation rather than simply eliminated as threats. During a brief respite while we fortified a defensible position in what appeared to be a laboratory section, Vulov finally broke down and revealed the full scope of what we were facing. His confession changed our understanding of the mission from rescue operation to something far more significant and far more dangerous. "I lied about my background," he said, his voice breaking under the weight of 3 decades of guilt and growing understanding of the magnitude of what we had encountered. "I'm not just a geological engineer with knowledge of Soviet research protocols. I'm Dr. Marek Volkov, chief geneticist for Project Chimera, and one of only 3 researchers who escaped when the facility fell 30 years ago." His revelation explained his familiarity with the installation's layout and his obvious personal connection to the documentation we'd been finding, but it also meant that our mission had been compromised from the beginning. We weren't investigating an unknown situation. We were walking into a trap that had been carefully prepared by intelligence that understood human psychology and tactical capabilities better than we understood ourselves. "We didn't create monsters," Volkov continued, his hands shaking as weapon fire echoed from the corridors around our defensive position. "We awakened Earth's original inhabitants, beings that possessed this planet long before natural evolution took the wrong path and created the limited life forms we see today. The template we found in the ice isn't alien technology, it's terrestrial. It's what this planet's life was supposed to become before some cosmic catastrophe derailed normal evolutionary development millions of years ago. The creatures weren't invaders or aberrations created by human genetic engineering. They were the planet's rightful inhabitants, awakening from eons of dormancy to reclaim a world that had evolved along unintended paths. And they viewed humanity not as enemies to be destroyed, but as raw material to be corrected according to the original biological design that had been interrupted by cosmic accident. They remember everything, Volkov continued as the sounds of tactical movement echoed through the facility around us. Not just from their individual human lives, but from before, from the genetic memory that goes back to the planet's formation, and the original biological template that was supposed to guide all terrestrial development. They know what went wrong with evolution on Earth, and they have the knowledge necessary to correct those errors. The implications of his revelation were staggering. Every human being carried dormant genetic potential that could be activated by the right catalysts, transforming them into something that combined human intelligence with capabilities that belonged to Earth's original biological design. The creatures we were fighting weren't trying to destroy humanity, they were trying to complete it. The transformation process isn't random mutation or genetic modification, Volkov explained, his voice becoming more urgent as the tactical situation around us continued to deteriorate. It's the activation of genetic potential that exists in every living thing on Earth, waiting for the right conditions to express itself according to the original template, and those conditions are being created by environmental changes that humanity doesn't even recognize as significant. Dr. Wynne made her fatal mistake during our next firefight, while engaging a transformed subject that had learned to use human tactical principles against us with devastating effectiveness. Her protective mask was damaged, by organic projectiles that seemed designed specifically to breach human protective equipment, using chemical compounds that could dissolve through materials that should have been chemically inert. The transformation process began immediately upon exposure to the spore-rich atmosphere. Instead of the violent mutations I'd expected based on the research documentation, Dr. Wynne underwent what could only be described as guided evolution, a controlled metamorphosis that followed predetermined patterns encoded in the genetic template. Her body reconfigured itself with organic efficiency that was beautiful and horrifying to witness. Each change flowed seamlessly into the next, as the alien template rewrote her genetic code in real time, optimizing her physiology for capabilities that human evolution had never developed. Her skeletal structure shifted to accommodate enhanced sensory organs, while her nervous system developed new neural pathways that allowed direct interface with the facility's biological systems. But she retained her human memories, personality, and tactical knowledge throughout the process, making her infinitely more dangerous than any creature we'd previously encountered. When she turned her enhanced capabilities against us, it was with intimate knowledge of our equipment, training, and psychological weaknesses. "You can't understand what this feels like," she said, her transformed eyes focusing on our defensive positions, with predatory calculation that combined human intelligence with alien sensory capabilities. "The limitations are gone. The barriers that kept us isolated from real understanding have been removed. I can feel the planet's history, Nathan. I can sense the patterns that connect every living thing on Earth." Her voice had changed, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in our minds, rather than traveling through air as conventional sound waves. When she spoke, I could feel the meaning of her words bypassing my ears entirely, communicating concepts that human language couldn't express through methods that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. The firefight that followed was desperate and brutally one-sided. Dr. Wynne moved through our defensive fire like it was rain, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to track individual bullets and adjust her movement accordingly. She used the facility's biological systems to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, turning our own defensive preparations against us with tactical creativity that exceeded anything in human military doctrine. She could interface directly with the organic conduits that lined the facility's walls, using them to coordinate attacks from transformed subjects throughout the complex. Her enhanced sensory capabilities allowed her to perceive our movements through solid matter, making concealment impossible and turning every tactical advantage we possessed into a liability. But worse than her physical capabilities was her psychological warfare. She knew exactly what to say to shake our confidence, exactly which memories to reference to make us doubt our mission, exactly how to exploit the growing fear that we were fighting a war that humanity couldn't win. "This isn't about destroying your species," she said during a brief lull in the combat, her voice carrying implications that made my tactical training feel inadequate. "It's about completing what was interrupted millions of years ago. The evolutionary path you're following leads to extinction within centuries. We're offering a way forward that preserves what's valuable about human consciousness while eliminating the limitations that doom your species to failure." Kincaid made the decision to fall back to the facility's core chamber, where we could make a final stand with our remaining explosives and attempt to deny the installation to whatever intelligence was controlling the transformation process. But as we fought our way through corridors filled with transformed subjects that seemed to anticipate our every tactical decision, it became clear that we weren't just retreating, we were being herded towards a specific destination. The creatures wanted us in the core chamber for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience or tactical advantage. They were guiding us towards something that required our presence, something that needed human consciousness as a component rather than an obstacle. The journey to the core took 3 hours of continuous combat through passages that seemed to reconfigure themselves to control our movement. We encountered resistance that was precisely calibrated to slow our progress without stopping it entirely, as if the facility's defensive systems were operating according to a schedule that required our arrival at a specific time. Maria's equipment detected massive power buildups throughout the complex, suggesting that systems which had been dormant for decades were coming online in preparation for something significant. "The energy readings are off the charts," she reported between tactical movements. "Whatever they're powering up down here, it's drawing more electricity than most cities." The final confrontation took place in a vast chamber where the boundary between technology and biology had been completely erased. The space pulsed with organic rhythms that matched human cardiac patterns, while the air itself seemed alive with purpose that made our equipment malfunction from proximity alone. The chamber was enormous, easily large enough to house aircraft carriers, with architecture that extended upward and downward beyond the reach of our lights. But it was an empty space. Every surface was covered with organic systems that breathed with visible rhythm, processing streams of bioluminescent data that flowed like liquid light through conduits that extended deep into the Antarctic ice sheet. Dozens of transformed subjects surrounded us, but they weren't attacking or even showing signs of aggression. They were waiting, watching with eyes that held intelligence far beyond anything human, arranged in patterns that suggested ceremonial rather than tactical significance. In the center of the chamber, massive biological systems were processing information at rates that exceeded electronic computation. The data streams contained genetic codes for every species on Earth, but modified according to the template we discovered in the ice cores. It was a comprehensive plan for planetary transformation that would affect every living thing on the surface within a matter of decades. I realized that Complex Zero wasn't just a facility or research installation. It was a nerve center for a biological network that spanned the entire Antarctic continent. The creatures had spent 30 years expanding their influence through the ice sheet, building infrastructure that would allow them to extend their reach to the surface world when environmental conditions were optimal. The facility was preparing to begin global transformation using atmospheric dispersal systems that would carry the evolutionary template to every corner of the planet. Within days, the modified organisms would be in the jet stream. Within weeks, they would be integrated into every major ecosystem on Earth. Within months, the transformation of all terrestrial life would be irreversible. "The process has already begun," the transformed Dr. Wynne explained, her enhanced consciousness interfacing directly with the chamber's biological systems to show us data streams that revealed the true scope of what we were witnessing. Climate change, atmospheric pollution, electromagnetic interference from human technology, these aren't environmental problems. They're preparation phases, weakening the barriers that prevent optimal conditions for template activation. The display showed global atmospheric conditions that had been carefully engineered over decades to create optimal environments for biological transformation. Rising temperatures that activated dormant genetic sequences. Chemical pollutants that broke down cellular resistance to template integration. Electromagnetic fields that enhanced organic conductivity and neural interface capabilities. Everything your species has done to modify planetary conditions has been guided by the template's influence, she continued, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's organic systems respond with visible excitement. "You think you've been making independent choices about industrial development and technological advancement, but you've been following genetic imperatives that were programmed millions of years ago." Humanity hadn't been destroying the planet through ignorance or greed. We'd been unconsciously preparing it for transformation according to genetic instructions that we carried in our DNA without recognizing their purpose. Every environmental change that we thought was accidental had been guided by dormant biological programming that was finally approaching activation. Kincaid armed our remaining explosives while the transformed subjects watched with expressions that might have been sympathy or pity. They understood that fear and desperation would drive us to violence, and they seemed to accept our choice with something like forgiveness for our inability to comprehend the magnitude of what they were offering. "This isn't about conquest or destruction," Dr. Wynne said, her enhanced capabilities allowing her to perceive our emotional states and respond to our psychological resistance with arguments designed to overcome human conditioning. "It's about survival. Your species is approaching multiple extinction scenarios that will occur within the next 2 centuries. Environmental collapse, resource depletion, genetic degradation, technological singularity events that will replace human consciousness with artificial alternatives. The data streams in the chamber showed projections for human civilization that were universally catastrophic, regardless of current policy changes or technological developments. Every scenario led to extinction or replacement by non-biological intelligence within timeframes that made current human planning seem pathetically short-sighted. The template offers an alternative," she continued, her voice carrying certainty that came from access to genetic memory spanning millions of years of planetary development. Enhanced physical capabilities that can survive environmental changes that would kill unmodified humans. Cognitive improvements that can solve resource management problems that current human intelligence can't address. Biological integration with planetary systems that makes extinction scenarios irrelevant. But Kincaid triggered the detonation sequence anyway, sending cascading explosions through biological systems that had been operating since before human civilization began. The facility's organic components screamed with sounds that seemed to express genuine pain as their neural networks were severed by high explosives designed to destroy conventional technology. The destruction of the chamber's primary systems sent feedback through the entire Antarctic network, causing seismic events that were detected by monitoring stations around the world. But even as the explosions tore through the installation's biological infrastructure, I could see that we damaged only a fraction of the total system. I fought my way through collapsing passages as the complex died around me, pursued by transformed subjects that seemed more concerned with evacuation procedures than revenge against the humans who just destroyed decades of preparation. Their behavior suggested that our attack had been anticipated and prepared for, as if destroying Complex Zero had been part of their long-term planning, rather than a setback. The journey to the surface took 6 hours through passages that were closing behind me like healing wounds. The facility was sealing itself, protecting the remaining systems from further damage while isolating the destroyed sections to prevent contamination of the broader network. Thompson found me 12 hours later, half buried in snow and suffering from injuries that included the bullet wound in my shoulder, a souvenir from my final firefight with the transformed Dr. Wynne. But the wound had characteristics that medical examination couldn't explain. The tissue around the impact site was healing faster than human physiology should allow, and the bullet itself had dissolved into metallic compounds that were integrating with my cellular structure. The helicopter extraction felt like escape from a war zone, where the enemy had been fighting with weapons and tactics that human military doctrine had never anticipated. But as we flew away from the crater, I could see thermal signatures in the ice below that destroyed any hope of victory or successful mission completion. Geometric patterns extended for hundreds of miles in every direction, suggesting installations that dwarfed Complex Zero in scale and capability. Energy readings indicated that our destruction of one facility had triggered activation sequences throughout the network, accelerating preparations for global transformation rather than stopping them. The creatures weren't gone. We had simply damaged one installation in a system that included dozens of others, and our attack had provided them with valuable intelligence about human capabilities and limitations that would improve their defensive preparations for future encounters. Since my return to surface civilization, I've dedicated every waking moment to understanding the true scope of what we discovered beneath the Antarctic ice. Through careful research and contact with other survivors of similar encounters, I've pieced together evidence of a global biological network that's been preparing for planetary transformation for far longer than the 30 years since Project Chimera began. Military installations around the world have reported encounters with enhanced organisms that demonstrate tactical intelligence and coordinated behavior that exceeds anything in human doctrine. These engagements often end with missing personnel and equipment modifications that suggest ongoing biological integration programs operating on a global scale. Deep-sea exploration teams have discovered structures on the ocean floor that match the architecture of Complex Zero, suggesting that the Antarctic installation was just one node in a network that includes underwater facilities on every continent. Archaeological expeditions have uncovered ruins that predate human civilization, but show clear evidence of the same biological engineering principles. Most disturbing are the reports from combat zones around the world, where soldiers have encountered enemies that seem to anticipate their tactics and adapt to their weapons in real time. These engagements often result in personnel who return from deployment with enhanced capabilities they can't explain, suggesting that transformation processes are being implemented through military operations rather than civilian exposure. The modifications aren't random mutations or conventional genetic engineering. They're the activation of dormant genetic potential that exists in every human being, triggered by stress hormones and adrenaline production during combat situations. The template is designed to activate during moments of maximum human aggression, turning our own survival instincts and military capabilities against us. Intelligence agencies have detected atmospheric changes that suggest biological agents are already present in global air circulation systems. The compounds involved are sophisticated enough to remain dormant until specific activation conditions are met, but advanced enough to begin immediate transformation processes when those conditions occur. I've been contacted by military personnel, intelligence operatives, and private contractors who've encountered similar phenomena in remote locations around the world: Alaska, Siberia, Greenland, the deep ocean floors, mountain ranges that haven't been fully explored. Everywhere humanity is pushed into unexplored territory, we've found evidence of the template's influence and preparation for global activation. The creatures we encountered aren't monsters or invaders from another planet. They're Earth's original inhabitants, awakening from millions of years of dormancy to reclaim a world that evolved along paths that were never intended by the original biological design. And they're using our own weapons, our own tactics, our own aggressive instincts to accelerate the transformation process. They remember everything, not just individual combat experience from their human lives, but the entire military history of human conflict, spanning thousands of years. They've been learning from every war, every battle, every tactical innovation that humanity has developed, and now they're implementing that knowledge in ways that make human military capabilities obsolete. The ice sheets are melting faster than any climate model predicted. The permafrost is releasing organisms that have been dormant since before human civilization began. And combat zones around the world are becoming transformation laboratories where human soldiers are being upgraded according to the original template that predates terrestrial evolution. When the final phase begins, it won't be an invasion that humanity can fight with conventional weapons or traditional military strategies. It will be an awakening that uses our own military capabilities to accelerate global biological correction, turning every weapon we've developed and every tactic we've mastered against us. The war has already started, but humanity doesn't realize we're losing it because we don't understand what victory conditions look like for an enemy that views our destruction as an act of mercy rather than conquest. They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to save us from the extinction events that our current evolutionary path makes inevitable. but their definition of salvation requires abandoning everything that we consider essentially human and accepting transformation into something that combines human consciousness with capabilities that belong to Earth's original biological design. Template. Every day, more people around the world report experiences that suggest early-stage transformation processes, enhanced physical capabilities that develop overnight, sensory improvements that allow perception of electromagnetic spectra that human vision shouldn't access, cognitive changes that provide solutions to problems that normal human intelligence can't solve. The modifications are being presented as improvements rather than infections, making them attractive to individuals who are struggling with the limitations of normal human physiology. But each transformation represents the loss of another human consciousness to the template's influence, and the gain of another enhanced individual working towards planetary conversion. If you're reading this account and thinking it's just an entertaining story, I need you to understand that every major government maintains research programs studying genetic modification techniques that make Project Chimera look primitive. There are weapon systems designed to deal with biological threats that officially don't exist. There are contingency plans for scenarios involving the transformation of human populations according to unknown genetic templates. They know what's coming. They've been preparing for decades. But preparation won't be enough when the enemy uses your own preparations against you with tactical intelligence that exceeds anything human military science has developed. Watch for the signs that indicate transformation processes are beginning in your area. Personnel who return from military deployment with capabilities they can't explain. Equipment modifications that improve performance using principles that human engineering hasn't developed. Combat training exercises that seem designed to test responses to enemies with superhuman capabilities. And if you ever find yourself in a firefight with something that moves faster than human reflexes can track, shoots back with projectiles that violate ballistic physics, and coordinates tactics using communication methods that bypass electronic systems, don't try to win that engagement. Just survive it long enough to spread the warning to others. The factory beneath the ice was just a training ground where Earth's original children perfected the art of war, using human knowledge, improved by intelligence that predates our species by millions of years. Now they're ready to graduate to the surface world where every conflict zone will become a classroom for teaching humanity what real combat capability looks like when it's guided by genetic memory that spans geological ages. They remember everything. They've learned from everything. They've improved on everything. And they're coming to show us what happens when human military science meets biological engineering that treats our entire species as raw material for optimization. The transformation isn't coming through peaceful conversion or gradual cultural change. It's coming through combat that will demonstrate the futility of resistance while providing opportunities for enhancement to those who survive the initial encounters. We're not just facing an enemy that's better armed or better trained. We're facing an enemy that understands human warfare better than we do, because they've been studying our conflicts for thousands of years and perfecting improvements that make our advantages irrelevant. The war has already started, and we're going to lose that war using our own weapons, improved by an enemy that treats human military history like an instruction manual for planetary conquest. They've been studying us through every conflict we've ever fought. Now it's time for them to demonstrate what they've learned.